When I first met our next speaker, Jaime Clark-Souls, she was wearing a black wetsuit and about to go paddleboarding in the frigid Atlantic. I thought she was this very serious theologian, which she is, but oh, she is so much more. As a distinguished professor at Perkins Theological Seminary, she has taught generations of students and written books of academic sophistication, yet accessible to anyone. She was in the Johns Hopkins study on psychedelics and religious leaders with, yes, Mary Cosimano. A few years ago, she was unsure if she should go public with her psychedelic experiences. Today, she is one of the world's leading authorities on psychedelics and religion. If you know of another ordained Baptist minister writing a book on psychedelics and soul care, please let me know. We'll have them right up here. Jaime embraces contradictions like that. She uncovers the truths beneath the truths we think we know. She brings joy and curiosity to the biggest mysteries of life, and she never hesitates to jump into the ocean. Few people I know can make me laugh so hard and think so deeply. I give you the paddleboarding, psychedelic, biblical scholar, and the most loyal friend anybody can have.
Good afternoon. Well, wow, what a joy and an honor to be here. My heart and my head are so full of everything we've heard and experienced here today, thanks to our visionary leaders. Am I the only one, or do you join with me? Yes. So, and a special thank you to my dear friend who really, that was too much. And yeah, so much love. Yeah. So how did a mostly nice ordained Baptist minister, New Testament scholar, seminary professor, grandmother of 2, soon to be 3, end up on this stage talking to you about psychedelics and spirituality? Well, I'm glad you asked. In seminary, I served in Connecticut Hospice, which was the first architecturally intentional hospice in the United States. It had a profound effect on me to be in my early 20s, journeying with people and their families through the death process. It was nothing less than holy ground, sometimes heartbreaking and loud and smelly, and other times awe-inspiring and peaceful and tender, but always holy ground. I was especially intrigued by the ways that these people and their families made sense of, or not, integrated or not, the experiences they were having into their own spiritual lives. I was surprised by the variety I heard, even from people who share a religious tradition. So I went on to get a PhD in biblical studies, and I became a seminary professor who regularly teaches a class called Evil, Suffering, Death, and the Afterlife. Very light topic. I am also a scholar of the Gospel of John, which is nothing if not mystical. So I am a scholar, and I am always interested in the advancement of human knowledge, but I am also a seminary professor who trains spiritual leaders who will soul journey with people from cradle to grave, in the being born, in the living, in the dying, and in all those in-between spaces where those things overlap. I myself am an ordained clergy person who is interested in matters of spiritual formation and the soul. So when I heard about the FDA-approved clinical trial at Johns Hopkins and NYU involving religious professionals and psychedelics, for me, it brought together both my academic and my ministerial interests. So I first met the inimitable Mary Cosimano, who did my psychological intake. So yes, she knows more than most people about me, and everything Bill said about her is true. Other leaders on that, of course, Roland Griffiths, may he rest in peace. Bill Richards was my guide, Tony Bossis, who we sorely miss today, and Steve Ross also led those studies. So there were about 25 of us, and we came from a bunch of different religious traditions. 3 of us from that group have started organizations. A couple of them are here today, so make sure that you meet them. So Zach Kamenetz started Shefaflo for Judaism. Hunt Priest started Ligare for Christianity. And our colleague Sugar Ahmed has started Rouhani for Islam. Yeah. So I myself, as Bill said, am finishing a book called Psychedelics and Soul Care, What Christians Need to Know, because I can tell you the church is woefully behind on this topic. So I greatly value other faiths, and I want to be clear that today I'll be speaking today from the tradition I know best, which is Christianity, but I do hope that it's in a way that it applies more broadly. So in the fall of 2017, I had 2 high-dose psilocybin sessions set 1 month apart. And like most participants in the study, I do count the sessions among the top 5 spiritual experiences of my entire life. A lot happened in those 7-hour journeys. And I'm guessing I'm not the only one in the room who has had a psychedelic journey. So there's a fine line between sharing of your stories to build connection and then boring other people to death with 7 hours of details of your journey. So what I will say is I encountered God in extremely profound ways. I experienced a very wide range of emotions, from love to belovedness, joy and laughter, awe and gratitude, to grief I didn't even know I had. And there were certainly some very challenging experiences and initially unwelcome lessons as well. So for instance, we all know it's customary for precious gems to show up in a psychedelic journey. So I was quite moved to watch people from my life being placed as gems onto this kind of really antique, hefty door. And it was all beautiful until a particular individual appeared, moving towards this door. And this was a person who had caused real harm that I didn't want anywhere near me or my family. So let's just say that God and I, right then and there, had a come to Jesus meeting about real forgiveness and who counts as a gem in God's eyes. Spoiler alert. Everyone, versus my eyes. It definitely involved resistance and a lot of cussing. And of course, it continued on after that session. I started therapy as one part of my response to God's invitation to grow in that area and in others. And maybe not surprisingly for a Bible scholar, I experienced my tradition scriptures in new and surprising ways. So at one point, I was experiencing John chapter 14, which says, in my father's house, there are many rooms. So I was there, it was this crystalline, spacious place, and I was in the central atrium, and I was looking up and seeing faces of people I love just bathed in light and love. And then at one point, a beloved mentor of mine who I hadn't seen or talked to in quite a long time appeared. And I thought, okay, well, that's pretty random, but hey, it's really nice to see you. I went back to my hotel room later that evening where I learned that he had died that very day. He had become an ancestor in what my tradition calls the Great Cloud of Witnesses, or the Communion of Saints. So 8 years later, I'm still learning from and integrating those psychedelic experiences. So when I was 18, a freshman in college, I was with a group that had rented a church camp for a retreat. Long story short, I had a vivid, embodied, mystical encounter with God. At that rented church camp on January 18th, 1986, I committed my life to Christ. That experience had direct personal and vocational effects, because here I am, an ordained Baptist Bible professor. I have to tell you that my psychedelic experiences also brought me into vivid, embodied, mystical encounter with God. And those experiences as well have had direct personal and vocational effects. So I now serve as a bridge figure between psychedelic spiritual experience and spiritual care. I am a field scholar for the Emory Center for Psychedelics and Spirituality, which is doing fantastic work. Please check it out. I'm an affiliated researcher at the Harvard Law School for the PULSE Initiative, which stands for Psychedelic Use, Law, and Spiritual Experience. And I also hang out with the Psychedelic Chaplaincy Network folks that Jaime Beachy, who is also here today, co-founded with Caroline Peacock. To me, collaboration is key, and many folks here today are doing just absolutely phenomenal work. So let's talk a bit about psychedelics in the context of spiritual transformation. So I'd like to remind you, remember Janine's fantastic movie, From Shock to Awe, the clip where the vet Matt talks about spiritual injury as the real thing that needs attention. So let's talk about this meeting the mystery. Christianity is no stranger to talk of mysteries and altered states of consciousness. In fact, Christianity is based upon the claim that people personally encountered, and still do, a dead man, Jesus of Nazareth, who had been executed by the Roman government in an act of capital punishment, who was then resurrected and who called them to a particular way of life we now call Christian. In other words, Christianity itself is fundamentally based upon mystical experiences had by the first followers of Jesus. Easter, the most important day and season in the Christian liturgical calendar, celebrates these resurrection encounters. In fact, the New Testament says the resurrected Jesus appeared to over 500 people, sometimes individually and sometimes in a group setting. The Christian Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, narrates such mystical experiences and even various induction techniques to invite them, including fasting and ecstatic dance. From Mary encountering the angel Gabriel, asking her to give birth to God, Jesus fasting in the wilderness for 40 days and encountering the wiles of the devil, but also being ministered to by angels. What about Peter, James, and John in the Transfiguration, story we call the Transfiguration, where they enter a cloud and they witness Jesus physically transformed and communing with the dead ancestors, Elijah and Moses, on a mountaintop while hearing the voice of God directly? What about Mary Magdalene, the first apostle, encountering the resurrected Jesus and trying her hardest to hold on to him so that he did not ascend? And the list goes on, and I'm not even going to start talking about the book of Revelation, so we won't come out of that. So when contemporary Christians have psychedelic mystical experiences, whether in the context of medical treatment or in the context of intentional spiritual formation practices, they stand in a long line of ancestors who have traveled this terrain. So take the Apostle Paul, for example, a crucial figure in earliest Christianity. He says this, "Do not be conformed to the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind so that you may discern the will of God, what is true and acceptable and mature." And he's talking about transformation from his own multiple experiences of mystical encounters with God, sometimes in individual settings, sometimes in communal settings. And they have the same elements, right, that we hear from folks who have had psychedelic experiences. Here I'm just going to quickly name 3 of those. 1, fully embodied experiences of God that involve the senses, the emotions, the whole package. 2, healing, because all of our sources agree that Jesus was a lot of things, but healing was at the very center of his ministry. It's what salvation means in the Bible. And 3, the call to become a deeper person who lives in right relationship to self and God and the whole cosmos. So the book of Acts tells the story of Paul's radical transformation on the road to Damascus, not once, not twice, but 3 times, which shows you that it's quite important to his identity. So we hear this, "Now as he was going along and approaching Damascus, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, 'Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?' He asked, 'Who are you, Lord?' The reply came, 'I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting.' Paul then becomes blind as a result. Now the story's really long, but he ends up becoming what some call the second founder of Christianity. He went from destroying the church to growing the church. He went to spending his life calling others to a life of transformation. So in this case, Paul was both cured of a physical ailment and he was healed, right? These are not synonymous terms, cure and healing in the Bible. So he was cured of the visual impairment. He was healed of his spiritual illness or his spiritual injury that had led him to a life of violence. In the letter to the Corinthians, the second letter, he tells us directly about his experiences of visions and revelations. Here's what he says. "It is necessary to boast. Nothing is to be gained by it, but I will go on to visions, multiple, and revelations of the Lord. I know a person in Christ," here he's talking about himself, "who 14 years ago was caught up to the 3rd heaven. Whether in the body or out of the body, I don't know, God knows. Was caught up, I know that such a person whether in the body or out of the body, I don't know, God knows, was caught up into paradise and heard things that are not to be told, that no mortal is permitted to repeat. Aren't you curious? I am. I don't think it's much better than paradise, right? And I'm sure he had experiences of awe and glory, right? But Paul goes on to share what we would call a challenging, unwelcome, distressing experience, right, in the psychedelic studies. He calls it a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. Paul hates his chronic physical ailment, and he begs God, not once, not twice, but 3 times, that it may leave him. And he hears God directly say to him, nope. Well, that's not exactly what God said. God said this, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. In other words, this time Paul does not get a medical cure, but he does get healed. The healing comes from his transformed relationship and understanding and meaning-making about his bodily ailment, to the point where he enthusiastically declares, therefore I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities for the sake of Christ. For whenever I am weak, then I am strong. Paul could not change the facts, but he could change his response to the facts. That is healing. And I think this serves as a beautiful example for those of us seeking to integrate our own challenging experiences. So, like my earlier story about forgiveness, I could not change the facts, but I was invited to change my response. But this does take intention and regular practice, right? I think we all know the quote from Houston Smith that says a religious experience does not constitute a religious life. It's just an invitation. And we are helped by working these out, these experiences, working them out in community. We are better together. In the end, the question must always be, so what? What are the effects in our daily lives of such experiences? Do they lead to wisdom and insight and virtues like compassion, humility, justice, service? Paul provides a very handy, easily memorizable list. If you're Baptist, we like to memorize a lot of scripture. So there's this little memorizable list in Galatians 5. It goes like this. If you want to memorize them, the first 3 are 1 syllable, the next are 2 syllables, and the third 3 are 3 syllables. You ready? Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, and self-control. So do you see how Paul's experience coheres with psychedelic journeys that involve 1, embodied encounter with the divine, 2, healing, and 3, transformed life lived in service? Here's a true story. First I do want you to notice in that list, love, joy, peace, I want you to notice, to Mary's point, she did this so beautifully, I want you to notice that love is what Paul puts first, right? He is obsessed with love, as was Jesus before him. He famously says in 1 Corinthians 13, and now abide these 3, faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of these is, and in 1 John, we hear perfect love casts out fear. So here's a true story. Last week, I was jogging on the treadmill, listening to my playlist, same playlist I've been listening to for years, while mulling over this very talk. Next thing I know, I hear this, and I silently sing, right, mouthing the words. People, come on, tell me, where is your kingdom of heaven? Where is your faith? Where do you put your fear? Do you have a price for the truth and a price for believing? Heaven is here. Heaven is here. My God is love. My God is peace. My God is you. My God is me. I said to myself, exactly. I am using that in my talk. That is perfect. And then I was like, wait a second. Who sings this? And I stopped. I was like, is it Melissa Etheridge? And it is Melissa Etheridge. And I had just learned that she had decided to sponsor our gathering. So she's a generous donor from today. So, yeah. So I love all of the synchronicities that have brought every one of us here together today. And I am excited to join you in working for the flourishing of all inhabitants of this beautiful and complicated world. This world that God so loves, so that indeed it may be on earth as it is in heaven. Thank you.